lots of first timers in particular, right, tend to make this mistake a lot, right? Which is that they're trying to solve a problem and they actually think of the product and of the company as the exact same thing, right? Which is, oh, we want to build XYZ. I have features 1 to 100. All of them are amazing. That's what I'm going to do, right? And that's actually the first big trap that a lot of companies fall into, right? Which is they think of life as a set of features. That's actually not a great way to build a company. And one of the first sort of, piece of advice I would give you is do not think of yourself as a list of features. And absolutely critical upfront is to understand how you plan to distribute what it is that you're building. You have to understand that the hardest thing a startup does is not build a product. Most people who come from product engineering backgrounds can build product. You've done it before and you'll do it again. It's actually, can you distribute a product? The 0 to 1 journey is there is definitely a product validation aspect to it, but that's not nearly as hard as it is to actually distribute what it is that you're building, right? How will your customers find out about you in an efficient manner? How will they come download your software and you work with it? And that's the sort of thing that too many first-time rookies don't spend any time thinking about. When you're doing your first pitch to VCs, when you're talking about your first prototype, it is already time to start thinking about distribution. And the best founders I find are able to engage in very deep and detailed distribution questions up front. And if you have not thought of it, and if you haven't spent time on it, if your answers are very shallow, then this is a real opportunity here for you to sort of step up your game and improve, because it will really help not just when you're thinking about raising capital, but it'll also help you in finding PMF and in sort of, building the product in a certain way. So very strongly recommend that distribution is a first-class problem at the same level as your product features themselves. The second one is is another interesting one. A lot of people get this wrong because they don't fully internalize what this means, right? The reality is that the first thing you build, right, you will actually have to mostly throw away. And the reason you have to throw away is because the act of building the first one is where you actually do a lot of problem discovery, right? And now I'm talking about product itself. I'm not talking so much about distribution, but I'm just talking about the fact that, as you think about features 1, 2, and 3 and how they interplay with each other and you sort of build it out, product, when it's first built actually works the way the customers think that they want, right? And most people tend to discover what they want after they start to, sort of work with the product, right? And if you think about it, that's not so hard to imagine, right? Which is that if you've never sat in a car, it would never occur to you that you would really like to have music in it, right? Simply because, you haven't actually pictured what it's like to drive yourself for long periods of time and how it's actually helpful to have some sort of, audio entertainment to keep you sort of lightly engaged and awake and all of that stuff, right? So these are the sorts of things that, people only sort of figure out when they start using a product, right? And it's very similar for you as you are building your product is to think about, is to let people play with it. And in order for them to play with it, they should be able to use it. And you will discover some very interesting things along the way, right? And so you want to be able to build something that you can throw away and then build a second version or a third version or a fourth version that's much more in line with the actual customer sort of core loop of satisfaction and is not just about, as we discussed earlier, it's not just a list of features that you're, sort of banging through, right? So yeah, so build to throw away is an important one. And I think the third one, again, very critical is, you should actually just try to list out your key insights, right? And this is from a communication perspective, very, very important, which is, again, lots of folks show up and they're like, oh, I have built, a product and it has a calendar and it has a way to send email and it has a way to log in and log out. And well, every piece of software does that, right? And that's not useful because those aren't insights. Those are, in a sense, table stakes, right? And so you will always need table stakes and you will have to build table stakes. But the most important question isn't really table stakes. It is, what is the key insight, right? So, if it's a SaaS software and you are able to save somebody an hour a week, right? you better be able to show them that you're saving them an hour a week, because, people are very bad judges of where they spend their time, right? So it's not sufficient to have a product that saves you an hour a week. You need a product that tells you, hey man, I just saved you an hour this week. Why don't you go have some fun with it? And just give me credit in your head that I was the guy who, I was the person that made it possible. So that's like a really interesting thing to sort of think through, which is what are your key insights? And then how are you going to enforce and remind users that that's what you're doing, right? I think is a really critical part of communicating what you're building in your first version. This again is a very key sort of insight. The whole concept of, just keeping it simple. When they say keep it simple, stupid, what they mean is, it's usually, amateur builders and early builders who cannot make choices, who end up building something that does everything, right? Because it's all the bells and whistles. And it's usually because the person who's building it is not smart enough to prioritize, what are the most important things that someone will do, and then just only build that, right? And so a lot of it comes from just, that. But it's really, really important to keep it simple. Recently, we were evaluating a game company, and we're looking at the game. And at one point, one of our colleagues was like, we've been looking at this now for a few hours and we still haven't figured it out. What are the chances that a user will figure it out, right? Like there are 6 investors on this call and they can't figure it out. Do the game users even know what they're doing, right? And that's the sort of critical insight that's important for people to sort of remember, which is, people don't have a ton of time to figure out what it is you're doing, right? So you have to make it simple, make it obvious, and make sure the value prop just, shines through like very, very quickly. I think that's the key sort of insight in building your first product prototype, is that you want to keep it very, very simple. And again, this is, guys, is a very important sort of insight, right? Which is you cannot really write code and solve a problem at the exact same time. Coding is one aspect and solving a problem is another aspect, right? And so as far as possible, what you actually want to do is you want to validate your solution without writing code, right? As much as you can. So, just as, and now this is, of course, a little bit of an interplay, right? If you don't build something that people can use a little bit, you won't get the deeper insights because they haven't really been able to, fully absorb what it means like to use the product, right? So this is an answer that is in direct conflict to that previous advice, right? And that's what's important always, is that there are two conflicting sort of drivers, and the right answer hopefully somewhere in between the two. But you want to try to validate as much as you can without needing to write code, right? And again, you'd be surprised at how well certain things can be validated, without having to write anything. And then there's a question of, when you have a solution is when you start writing code, right? So code is, when you say, what is coding, right? Coding is basically you're writing the code to a solution, to codify a solution, right? So you have to have a solution in your head before you can sort of write the code. Lots of people just start writing code and they're like, and I'm like, what are you writing? What are you trying to build? And they're like, oh, we don't know. We're going to figure it out on the way. And that's not a great place to be. When you think about your first prototype, is that sure, you want to build something that, works for lots of users and, is written to be very scalable, and, latency is an issue and you want to keep latency really low. And, along the way, you may want to invent your own programming language because the existing programming languages don't support what you're doing. And all of these things happen. But before you go down that path, there is a very nice path, which is this path, which is so many people now are building very interesting no-code tools, right? Which allow you to essentially do very cool things with configuration and with, a little bit of UI, UX mockups, and, with APIs that allow you to stitch these things together. And you would be foolish to sleep on it, right? And so if you're starting something in 2021 and you're not using a no-code tool to write your first version, I would argue you're making a mistake. Most likely, you're making a mistake. I'd go so far as to say maybe 90% of you are making a mistake if that's what you're doing, right? Just to give you a sense of how strongly I feel about it. And that's not to say that, you won't have to migrate off the tool, etc. Of course you will, right? Everything, everything only travels a certain distance and then is done, right? But it is useful for you through that distance, right? And I think that's sort of important to understand. When you're young, as a company, as a distribution method, as a startup, as a product, speed is an absolute weapon, right? Because, you can iterate very, very quickly. And the faster you iterate, the faster you move, the more you learn, right? And the more you learn, the faster you can sort of build a product and find PMF, right? Iteration makes insight generation faster. It makes building high quality product faster. And that's the key sort of insight that, again, that's very important as you're building your product prototypes. This is a very famous thing, and this is again a little bit of the underpinnings of why speed is a weapon, right? Which is this whole concept of what is called an OODA loop. But the OODA loop basically talks about the following, right? Which is that any game theory, any player in a game, right, broadly, approaches life in these 4 steps, right? Which is, first you observe, then you orient, then you decide, and then you act, right? And the number of times you can go through this loop faster and faster and faster, the better you are at execution, right? This is a framework that was invented to actually help figure out how planes should fight, right? And so it's actually a US Air Force construct, but it is very applicable to business. It's very applicable to any aspect of life, which, where game theory can apply, which is that what you want to do is you want to set up an OODA loop, and you want to be able to do more and more loops in the time it takes your competitor to do a single loop, right? Because then you can move faster and you can sort of, react faster and change things faster than your sort of opposition, right? What you want is maximum iterations, because as you do more iterations, you learn more, you fail more often, but, you also figure out what parts are more promising, what parts are less promising. The more you iterate, the faster you get to PMF, the faster you get to, finding real customer love. So iterate rapidly, iterate a lot, iterate without losing faith, and iterate without sort of, getting beaten down by the process. And, chances are you're going to build a very, very nice company and a very nice startup.